Number 12. The Dating Game Killer. Rodney Alcala had a respectable track record at first glance. He was extremely intelligent, earning him a place at prestigious colleges, including UCLA and New York University, during the 1960s. And in the early 1970s, Alcala worked as a counselor at a children's camp and for Blue Cross Blue Shield. By then, he'd been medically discharged from the U.S. Army for troubling behavior, as he was accused of assaulting several young women, disobeying orders, resisting authority, and going AWOL. His commanding officer described him as vindictive and manipulative, and a psychiatrist diagnosed Alcala with antisocial personality disorder. But he managed to avoid any scrutiny outside the military for his actions. By the time Alcala appeared on the TV show The Dating Game as an eligible bachelor in 1978, he'd already killed an unknown number of people, mostly women. At the time, he was working for the Los Angeles Times during the day. Alcala claimed to moonlight as a photographer, but in reality, he was luring young girls into secluded places for photo shoots and attacking them. While he'd gotten away with the murders, Alcala had spent time in prison for assault and was on parole, which the TV show's producers would have known if they'd run a background check on him. But they didn't, and he was extremely good at acting like a normal or even desirable guy. Bachelorette Cheryl Bradshaw even chose Alcala out of 3 contestants who were featured on the episode. Alcala had promised Bradshaw an unforgettable date, but Cheryl got a funny feeling that she couldn't ignore while she was talking to him backstage after the show. And she later told the Sydney Telegraph that Alcala acted creepy. Bradshaw ultimately decided not to go out with him and would eventually realize that her decision to trust her intuition likely saved her life. Authorities finally caught Alcala the following year after friends of one of his murder victims, Robin Samso, provided police with a physical description of a strange man who'd approached them shortly before Samso's death. A composite sketch was circulated, and Alcala's parole officer recognized him. Alcala was convicted of Samso's murder in 1980 and was sentenced to death, but the conviction was overturned because jurors had been improperly notified of his criminal history during the trial. He was convicted again in 1986 and was sentenced to death for a second time, but the verdict was nullified in 2003 based on another technicality. As DNA technology advanced, Alcala was connected to 4 more murders. He stood trial for a third time in 2010, this time for 5 counts of murder. And in addition to having DNA evidence on their side, prosecutors enjoyed the added benefit of Alcala's decision to represent himself at trial. But what followed was nothing short of bizarre. During the trial, Alcala called himself to the stand and interrogated himself for 5 hours, asking himself questions in a deeper-than-normal voice and answering with an unnaturally high pitch. And with each answer he gave, his voice became increasingly high-pitched. He claimed that he couldn't remember committing the murders, but made no attempt to dispute the allegations. And given his narcissistic tendencies, he likely thought he was the smartest person in the room. But to everyone watching, the display was simply weird and unconvincing. Alcala only called one other witness to the stand, a psychiatrist who testified that it was possible that the defendant didn't remember committing the murders due to borderline personality disorder. But the jury was unswayed, to say the least, and Alcala was convicted of the charges and sentenced to death for a third time. He was eventually convicted of 3 additional murders, but the true number of victims has been estimated at as many as 130. Alcala spent the rest of his years on death row, where he died in 2021 at the age of 77. During his decade-long crime spree, Alcala had kept a disturbing portfolio containing hundreds of photos of his victims, and more than a dozen women featured in the pictures remain unidentified to this day. Authorities have since released the images in hopes that members of the public will come forward with information that could help solve decades-old cold cases. Number 11. Christopher Watts. Shannon Watts was a doting mother of 2 who lived in Frederick, Colorado. She candidly shared her life on social media, where she often spoke about how happy she was to have a family with the love of her life, her husband, Christopher Watts. Christopher had a high-paying job, while Shannon followed her own pursuits as an aspiring businesswoman. They lived in a nice house and, by all appearances, were a successful, thriving family. It was clear, based on Shannon's online videos, that she was the more outgoing and extroverted partner, while Christopher came across as laid-back, mild-mannered, and perhaps even a little shy. Big news came in 2018 when Shannon announced on Facebook that she was pregnant. She did so by posting a video of herself revealing the news to Christopher, who seemed both surprised and excited to learn that they were expecting a third child. Things soon took a devastating turn, however, when Shannon vanished with the couple's two daughters, Bella and Celeste, shortly after returning to Colorado from a business trip. Christopher claimed to know nothing about the disappearance, but acted suspiciously unconcerned. In fact, it was Shannon's friends who called the police and reported her missing when they couldn't find her. While Christopher strangely treated his family's absence like it was no big deal, he was also initially cooperative with law enforcement, which earned him the benefit of the doubt. He allowed police to search the house, where they found Shannon's purse, keys, and phone, something she was never without for more than a few minutes at a time. But what was even more suspicious was that officers found Shannon's car in the garage with the little girl's car seats in it. A neighbor then told police that Christopher wasn't acting like himself and that he seemed a lot more nervous and anxious than usual. The cops initially chalked the unusual behavior up to the stress of having one's family go missing, but they soon began to wonder if perhaps the neighbor was onto something. It wasn't long before Christopher landed himself at the top of the suspect list. He failed a polygraph, at which point detectives began pushing him to come clean about what had happened. Under the mounting pressure, he eventually admitted that he was having an affair with a co-worker and was miserable in his marriage. Christopher also admitted that Shannon and the girls were dead, claiming that he caught Shannon killing the kids. It was too late to save them, so he murdered his wife in a fit of rage. 2 of the 3 bodies were recovered from crude oil tanks at one of Christopher's work sites, and Shannon was found buried in a shallow grave nearby. But further investigation told a much different story from what Christopher had claimed, and pointed straight at him as the killer of all 3 victims. In the weeks leading up to the murders, Shannon had confided in her friends about how Christopher had lost interest in being intimate with her. In fact, he not only treated her like a roommate, but like a stranger. One that he couldn't stand the thought of touching, much less having a meaningful conversation with. At the same time, whenever Shannon prodded her husband to open up about what was wrong, he promised that everything was fine and that he wasn't purposely acting withdrawn. The evidence against Christopher stacked up even more when his mistress, Nicole Kessinger, showed up at the police station and told detectives her side of the story. She said that Christopher had told her he was in the process of getting a divorce and that from her understanding they were boyfriend and girlfriend. They were planning on being together forever, but once the truth began to unfold, Nicole was compelled to do the right thing and cooperate with law enforcement. Nicole was ultimately cleared of any involvement in or knowledge of the murders. In fact, she was utterly sickened and devastated that Christopher slaughtered his family in order to pursue a future with her. After fulfilling any obligations related to the case, Nicole moved away and changed her identity to escape the publicity and notoriety that came with her position in the situation. After months of maintaining his innocence, Christopher Watts took a plea deal and admitted to the murders in exchange for having the death penalty taken off the table. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive and 2 concurrent life terms, which he's serving out at a prison in Wisconsin after having his safety threatened repeatedly by prisoners in Colorado. After the sentencing, he came clean with authorities about what really happened, admitting that he crumbled under the stress of an unhappy marriage, a 3rd unwanted child on the way, his desire to be with someone else, and financial issues that he and Shannon were having that nobody knew about. He saw his obligations as a husband and father as an inconvenience to the life he wanted and confessed to planning the murders well in advance. The final straw came when Shannon threatened to leave him and never let him see the kids again. According to his version of events, he lost his temper and strangled Shannon to death before killing the rest of his family in the same fashion. To make things even more disturbing, Christopher told investigators that he keeps photos of his victims in his prison cell and speaks to them daily. He works as a janitor at the prison and has also become obsessed with the Bible, claiming to be a born-again Christian. During his downtime, he also reportedly responds to the loads of letters he receives from women who are bizarrely fascinated with him. Luckily for the rest of society, he'll never see the light of day again outside prison walls. And as Christopher's 38th birthday approached in 2023, a prison spokesperson confirmed that he wouldn't get special treatment of any kind. No extra time in the rec yard, no special meal, and no other accommodations. Number 10. Marianne DeMetro. 50-year-old Nick Hallam was killed at his San Antonio, Texas home in April of 2023. Police responded to the scene after the victim's wife, 30-year-old Marianne DeMetro, dialed 911 and reported that her husband had been shot dead. She also allegedly claimed that she was held at gunpoint by the killer, but had managed to escape and call for help. Hallam was pronounced dead at the scene, where cops found him with a gunshot wound to the neck. DeMetro reportedly told first responders that she, Hallam, and 50-year-old Jose Carlos Alvarez were all drinking together when Alvarez suddenly shot her husband. Alvarez allegedly claimed that he killed Hallam in self-defense and that DeMetro had helped him try to move the body, but that it was too heavy even with the two of them working together. He also said that he and DeMetro were in a relationship and denied her claims that he'd tried to abduct her. Police arrested Alvarez on suspicion of murder, along with one count of altering, destroying, or concealing a corpse. And he's currently being held on bonds totaling $225,000. Shortly thereafter, investigators uncovered evidence that Marianne DeMetro wasn't a victim but a possible co-conspirator. They now believe that she was having a relationship of some sort with Alvarez and that she helped him cover up her husband's murder. According to San Antonio police spokesperson Ricardo Guzman, surveillance footage revealed that DeMetro helped Alvarez in his attempts to remove Hallam's body from the apartment. Guzman further claimed that DeMetro tried to clean up evidence at the scene and that it didn't appear in the video as if she was being held against her will. He hesitated to say for sure whether he believes Hallam's murder was the product of a love triangle gone horribly wrong, but he told reporters that he believes it could be possible. Detectives caught up with DeMetro at the San Antonio airport, where she was allegedly trying to board a flight out of the city, and arrested her on suspicion of altering, destroying, or concealing a human corpse. She's now being held on $45,000 bond at the Beara County Jail. Some people go out of their way to end a relationship without directly breaking up with or leaving their partner. And in the end, their lack of directness usually makes the situation a lot more complicated and dramatic than it needs to be. Number 9. Brent Christensen. Yingying Zhang was a promising young scholar with a bright future ahead of her. She came from a modest upbringing in the Chinese city of Nanping and went on to earn her master's degree in 2016. The following year, Zhang traveled to the US as a visiting scholar at the University of Illinois campus in Urbana, where she was considering pursuing her PhD in agricultural science. She'd also recently gotten engaged to her boyfriend, Zhao Lin Hao, who stayed in China during her visit to America. In June 2017, 2 months after arriving in Urbana, Zhang made plans to meet with a real estate agent to sign a lease for an off-campus apartment. She texted the agent saying she was running late and would arrive soon, but she never showed. Zhang's friends contacted authorities later that night after not being able to reach her for more than 7 hours, and an investigation was launched. Surveillance footage showed Zhang getting off a city bus to catch a connecting bus. She missed a connection, though, and was waiting at the bus stop for the next one when a black Saturn Astra pulled up. Zhang then got into the car and was never seen again. The security video was too grainy for investigators to get the car's license plate number, but the Saturn Astra is a rare model of car in the US. There were just 18 of them registered in Champaign County, and the Astra that picked Zhang up had a visibly damaged hubcap. Detectives quickly zeroed in on Brent Allen Christensen, a married PhD student at the university, who drove a black Saturn Astra with an identically damaged hubcap. At first glance, Christensen seemed like an unlikely suspect. He appeared to lead a quiet and respectable lifestyle as a dedicated physics scholar with a promising future. During questioning, he told investigators that he was either napping or playing video games at home when Zhang vanished. His wife was out of town at the time, and there was no way to confirm the alibi, but Christensen seemed completely calm, cool, and collected, as if he was sure the authorities would rule him out as a person of interest. but detectives remained highly suspicious of him, and he remained on their radar. Meanwhile, a massive search for Zhang ensued. Her family and fiancé traveled to the US to look for her. Law enforcement was hard at work, and the university's large Asian student community helped coordinate the effort. They were determined to find Zhang, and the FBI offered a $10,000 reward for information leading to the young woman's location. But unfortunately, her whereabouts remained a mystery. After reviewing the similarities between the car and the surveillance footage and Christensen's Astra, federal and local investigators brought him back in for questioning and obtained a search warrant for his car. The search revealed that the passenger side door had been meticulously cleaned compared to the rest of the vehicle, and eventually Christensen admitted under mounting pressure that he gave a ride to an Asian woman, but claimed that she panicked and got out of the car just a few blocks later because he made a wrong turn. Even after the admission, there still wasn't enough evidence to arrest Christensen, especially since Zhang was still missing. Authorities then placed him under surveillance, hoping to catch a break in the case. And after learning that he was in an open marriage and had a girlfriend, detectives asked a woman to wear a wire. She agreed. After all, if Christensen was innocent like she hoped, the evidence would hopefully clear his name. Several weeks after Zhang disappeared, the girlfriend wired up and attended a memorial walk in Zhang's honor with Christensen. During the event, Christensen admitted to his girlfriend that he took Zhang to his apartment and held her there against her will. He also claimed that he was a serial killer and that Zhang was his 13th victim, although authorities were unable to find evidence of any previous victims. Christensen was federally charged with kidnapping resulting in death and lying to the FBI, but he pleaded not guilty to the crime. Zhang's body still hadn't been found, but based on the evidence, prosecutors accused Christensen of beating the young woman with a baseball bat and decapitating her. They claimed he spent months planning to abduct and kill someone, and that he wanted the notoriety that comes along with being a known killer. At the beginning of Christensen's trial in 2019, his defense attorney admitted to the court that the defendant had killed Zhang, yet he maintained his not guilty plea, and the trial continued. After deliberating for less than 2 hours, the jury came back with a guilty verdict, and in the end he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. After the trial ended, Christensen revealed that he discarded Zhang's body in a dumpster, but her remains have never been found. Number 8. The Great Imposter. James D. Francis Shecker, better known as Jim, was more than just two-faced. Nicknamed the Great Imposter, he was a truly professional con man who used numerous false and stolen identities throughout his lifetime. Nobody knows his real name, and that includes the US government. His history of stealing identities dates at least as far back as 1960, when he returned to California from Okinawa as a military service member named Jim Shecker. From there, he took a Greyhound bus to Alexandria, Virginia, where he took up residence with his first wife, Arlene. She was extremely confused, considering the fact that her husband had never served in the military, and from her understanding, he was an engineer for the US government. But she was happy enough to see him to not ask too many questions, and she initially believed whatever story he gave her for why he was in uniform. To understand why Arlene was so accepting of Jim's bizarre behavior, you have to first remember that it was the early 60s. The era of female empowerment was right around the corner, but it hadn't exactly settled in yet. Back then, taking your husband's explanations at face value, however nonsensical or strange, was just part of being a dutiful wife. Arlene was also smitten by Jim's intellect and charm. He spoke multiple languages, including French, Chinese, Japanese, Spanish, Tagalog, and of course English. And he also had the cooking skills of a gourmet chef and was an experienced traveler who doted on his wife the way many women only ever dream about. As far as Arlene knew, Jim was born in Montreal. Investigators would later determine that his only connection to Canada came in the form of an engineering certificate that wasn't his, but that he managed to make use of it anyway. Jim's friend, Lynn Larson, later told the Washington Post that when he left Okinawa in 1960, he left in a hurry. Arlene eventually realized her husband wasn't who he claimed to be. She knew that he chose Richmond, Texas as his supposed birthplace because a fire had destroyed its public records. But in the months following Jim's return, he lost 2 fingers for reasons that remain unclear to this day. He also began writing an autobiography that cleverly told his life story without giving away any identifying details about his real name or background. By 1965, it had become clear to Arlene that there were at least two very different sides to Jim's personality. Beneath his suave exterior, he was extremely short-tempered and prone to fits of rage. He refused to discuss his job with Arlene, claiming it was top-secret government work. And while Jim had a legitimate-looking ID and a seemingly routine schedule, which included weekly outings in a Navy commander's uniform, his stories didn't add up. So Arlene reported her suspicions to the FBI. Agents visited the couple's home, where they found Jim in possession of two Department of Defense IDs. He claimed that he was a civilian employee who worked at military bases and that he wasn't a U.S. citizen. Jim also admitted that the Navy uniform he wore wasn't really his, and that he'd bought it second-hand. The feds were completely stumped when they tried to run a background check on him and found no record of his existence, period, including his birth and work history. And because there was no evidence that Jim was making money through his impersonations, the FBI declined to pursue criminal charges. But he told the people in his life that the agents left him alone because the CIA intervened and told them to back off. Shortly thereafter, Jim left Arlene. He then remarried in 1966 to a woman named Dorothy Jennings. They lived together in Falls Church, Virginia, where by all appearances they were an average suburban church-going couple. Over time, Jim convinced his neighbors that he was a CIA employee. His act was believable, and he even took one of his friends to a prestigious military dinner and was immediately let in when he showed his ID. There was no reason not to believe that Jim Shaker was the real deal. Throughout the 70s, the FBI continued trying to track Jim's true identity. They gathered bits and pieces of truths, including that he knew how to fly an F-9 fighter aircraft. Because he'd never served in the US military, the agency dug deeper to try figuring out which country he may have learned to fly the aircraft in. But still, his identity remained a mystery. In the meantime, Jim landed high-paying engineering jobs with the American government. He supervised complex projects while claiming that he had a master's degree and was a PhD student. Then, in 1974, Jim's colleagues realized that he was piggybacking off a retired engineer's stamped number. His projects were way over budget, and two of the bridges he designed collapsed. But by the time authorities issued an arrest warrant, Jim had fled to Maryland, where he continued pretending to be an engineer. A few months after landing a job, Jim quit, taking with him the personnel file of a gifted and highly educated 42-year-old scientist named Farland Spear, who was also known as Michael Carr Spear III. Around the same time, the real Spear vanished after being lured to Oklahoma on the promise of a job opportunity. Jim began using the name Michael Carr Spear while claiming to anyone who knew him that the CIA had assigned it to him as a new identity. But in reality, he'd stolen Spear's birth certificate and used it to obtain an Oklahoma driver's license. He landed a job for an energy company in Oklahoma based on his claim that he developed a revolutionary process for turning coal into gas. But in 1976, a private detective hired by Spear's father tracked Jim down and sent investigators to question him. During the interview, he claimed to be Spear despite looking and sounding nothing like the man he was impersonating. And by the next morning, Jim had fled Oklahoma. The real Spear's murdered remains were found in Oklahoma in 1978, 2.5 years after his disappearance. And his cause of death was determined to be from 2 gunshot wounds he'd sustained to the back of the head. Jim's friend Patrick O'Connor told the FBI that he helped dispose of the body. He was under the impression that Spear was a rogue CIA agent and that Jim had shot him during a gunfight. Believing a clandestine burial was necessary, O'Connor did what was asked of him. He kept silent on the matter until it became clear that Jim Shaker hadn't told him the truth about Spear's death. Federal agents tracked down and arrested Jim at a motel in Yreka, California. Several stolen IDs were found in his possession, including stolen documents belonging to his former roommate George William Johnston, who he'd lived with for a short time in Barrie, Ontario. And from mid-1977 until shortly before his capture in 1978, he called himself Dallas Dean Rust. Jim eventually bonded out of jail while awaiting trial for Spear's murder. He was soon nabbed for posing as an IRS agent in Redding, California, and received a 3-year prison sentence for the crime. During his trial for Spear's murder, he claimed he acted in self-defense. but he was convicted of the crime and sentenced to 10 years to life in federal prison. Records show that he was released in 1997 after serving 19 years. But who exactly was Jim Shecker? Where was he from? The unfortunate answer is that nobody seems to know, including the web sleuths who've tried cracking the case. They were also unable to definitively track his whereabouts following his prison release. It's highly unlikely that Jim is still alive, but if he were, he'd be extremely old. It's unclear when and where he passed away, given his tendency to use aliases. Assuming he continued to use the name Jim Shecker, there are several obituaries from around the country that could belong to him. So even in death, he continues to live up to his reputation as the Great Imposter. Number 7. John List. During the fall of 1971, residents in a Westfield, New Jersey neighborhood noticed that nobody had come or gone from the family home of 46-year-old accountant John E. List for several weeks, although some of the lights were still on. List's kids had also not shown up for school in quite a while, causing staff members to question their extended absences. While conducting a welfare check, police encountered what can only be described as a scene straight out of a horror movie. Inside the home, they found the murdered bodies of List's 46-year-old wife, Helen, his children, Patricia, John Jr. and Frederick, and his 85-year-old mother, Alma. They'd all been shot to death, and organ music was playing on the home's intercom system. List was nowhere to be found, but he'd left behind a disturbing letter to his pastor, stating that he saw too much evil in the world and confessing to the murder of his family. Further investigation revealed that List had been struggling to hold steady work and afford his mortgage in recent years. He'd also started taking money from his mother's bank account to support his family. Shortly after the bodies were discovered, List's car was found outside JFK International Airport in Queens, New York. The FBI quickly got involved, but failed to detect any trace of List in the US or abroad. It was almost as if he'd vanished into thin air. After failing to turn up any signs of List for 18 years, law enforcement turned to America's Most Wanted for help. The show's producers hired a forensic sculptor who created a rendition of what List might look like nearly 2 decades after he was last seen in New Jersey. A criminal psychologist was also brought on board. He theorized that List would still be wearing the same horn-rimmed glasses he used to wear in an effort to look successful. The segment aired in May 1989, reaching 22 million viewers right in their homes. A woman living in suburban Richmond, Virginia, noticed that the bust of List resembled her neighbor, Robert Clark, who wore the same type of horn-rimmed glasses that the psychologist mentioned on the show. She then phoned in a tip, and agents visited Mr. Clark's home. By all appearances, Robert Clark was a respectable Christian man who lived a quiet and law-abiding existence. He was married to a woman he'd met at church, and there was no reason to suspect him of being a fugitive, other than the fact that the age-progressed image featured on America's Most Wanted reminded his neighbor of him. But fingerprints proved that Robert Clark was the long-missing John List. After eluding law enforcement for nearly 20 years, he was finally taken into custody on 5 counts of murder. During his trial in 1990, prosecutors argued that he was merely suffering from a midlife crisis when he massacred his family, rather than a severe mental breakdown. They also said that he selfishly solved a temporary problem with a permanent solution. In the end, List was found guilty and sentenced to 5 life terms, 1 for each family member that he killed. He appealed his conviction, blaming his actions on post-traumatic stress disorder resulting from his military service during World War II and the Korean War. But the original ruling was upheld, and List remained in prison until his death in 2008 at the age of 82. Number 6. Lawrence Chanda and Teresa Baumgardner. After not seeing or hearing from her 20-year-old daughter, Jessie Wilfong, for several days in May 2022, the young woman's mother reported her missing in Cape Girardeau County, Missouri. According to detectives, Jessie was last seen at the home of her uncle, Lawrence Chanda, and his girlfriend, Teresa Baumgardner, in the town of Millersville. She'd called Baumgardner earlier that night and asked for a ride. The couple claimed that Jessie had vanished from their property in the middle of the night. Surveillance footage showed Jessie and Lawrence Chanda leaving together in a pickup truck late at night and returning to the house shortly after 1 a.m. But this was the last time Jesse was seen alive. Teresa Baumgardner allegedly told sheriff's deputies that Jesse had spent the night drinking and talking around a bonfire with her and Chanda. And according to Baumgardner's version of events, Jesse asked for a ride at some point during the night, and the couple refused. Baumgardner further claimed that when she and Chanda woke up, Jesse was gone, leading the couple to believe that she left the property sometime between 4 and 6 a.m. But they didn't think anything was wrong, so they didn't report her missing. Shortly into the investigation, a confidential witness told law enforcement that within days of Jesse's disappearance, he saw Baumgardner and Chanda spending an unusual amount of time near a barn on his property, which he planned to sell to the couple. The next day, the witness said he saw Baumgardner's truck backed up to the barn. Chanda was nearby, sweating profusely and covered in dirt and mud. According to the informant, Chanda then gave him an envelope filled with $20,000 in cash as a down payment on the property. When the witness asked Chanda about what he was doing in the barn, Chanda allegedly claimed that he'd been cleaning it out. A few days later, another confidential witness came forward and said that Baumgardner had told her that Chanda and Jesse got into an altercation shortly before Jesse went missing. The witness claimed that Baumgardner said Chanda had beaten Jesse severely, yet when questioned by detectives, she never mentioned the incident. Detectives thought it was a pretty big detail to leave out, and their suspicions against Chanda and Baumgardner only grew from there. They questioned Chanda, who reportedly admitted to getting into an argument with Jesse. He said he suspected her of giving police information that implicated him in illegal drug activities. During a search of Chanda and Baumgardner's home the following week, deputies noticed that a large section of carpet and padding had been cut away in the hallway and dining room. Then, 2 days later, the first confidential witness, the one who planned to sell property to the suspects, told detectives that he met up with Baumgardner and that she admitted that Chanda killed Jesse. She allegedly told the witness that Jesse's body was buried on his property. The next day, deputies visited the property and noticed that the ground inside the barn was disturbed. They then dug up the dirt, and sure enough, they found Jesse's body. And based on her wounds, they determined that she'd been stabbed multiple times. More than a month after Jesse disappeared, Chanda and Baumgardner were finally arrested on suspicion of first-degree murder, armed criminal action, and tampering with physical evidence in a felony investigation. They remain behind bars at the Cape Girardeau County Jail on $5 million bond each while awaiting the next steps in the case. Number 5. Jennifer Ann Hall. As a respiratory therapist, Jennifer Ann Hall's job was to help people who struggle with breathing and cardiopulmonary disorders and illnesses. And as a medical worker, she took an oath to never do any harm to her patients. Early on in her career, she was employed at Hendrick Medical Center, a 49-bed hospital in Chillicothe, Missouri. In the 5 months Hall spent working at the facility from late 2001 to early 2002, 18 patients suffered cardiac or respiratory arrest. 9 survived, and the other half died. But even for a respiratory hospital, this was a staggeringly high number of medical emergencies and deaths. On average, just 1 patient died at Hendrick every year from cardiac arrest before Hall began working there. All signs pointed toward her possibly having something to do with this sudden spike in cardiac events. So after the 9th death, Hall was put on administrative leave, effectively ending her employment at Hendrick. In 2010, several surviving families filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Hall. It took 2 more years before authorities finally launched an investigation in 2012. The investigation carried on for years, and Hall knew she was at the center of it. In 2015, she denied any accountability, telling the Kansas City Star that her name was just thrown out there for horrifying reasons. But finally, in May of 2022, 20 years after the bizarre spate of patient deaths, Hall was charged with first-degree murder for the death of 75-year-old Fern Franco, who passed away at Hendrick in 2002 while hospitalized with pneumonia. A nurse found Franco unable to breathe and was unable to revive her. The elderly woman had morphine and succinylcholine in her system, which was troubling since neither drug was prescribed to her. According to a probable cause warrant, treatment, the succinylcholine would have paralyzed Franco's muscles, causing her to suffocate to death while conscious. While behind bars on the first pending murder charge in early 2023, Hall was charged with another count of first-degree murder in connection with the death of 37-year-old David Wesley Harper, who was hospitalized at Hendrick in 2002 with bronchitis. After 2 days of steady improvement, his condition took a sudden turn for the worse. By the time staff members found Harper, he was severely brain damaged from a lack of oxygen, and in the end, the team was unable to revive him, and he died from his injuries. Hall claimed she wasn't near Harper around the time of the incident, but records would later put her in his room twice within 25 minutes of his death. And a vial of succinylcholine was found in Hall's pocket, even though she wasn't authorized to administer the drug. After Hall's arrests, her defense attorney Molly Hastings told Law and Crime that the charges weren't based on new evidence. She said she looked forward to defending Hall in court. But the case took an unexpected turn in April 2023 when, after maintaining her innocence for over a decade, Hall pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree involuntary manslaughter and 1 count of second-degree attempted assault. As part of a plea deal, she admitted to recklessly but not intentionally causing the death of Fern Franco and an 82-year-old World War II veteran named Koval Gann. Hall also admitted to putting insulin into the breathing apparatus of a patient named Norma Pearson, who died in 2011. She wasn't required to accept responsibility for David Harper's death, though, and the murder charges against her were dropped. At the moment, Hall faces up to 18 years in prison and is currently awaiting sentencing from behind bars at the Clinton County Jail. Number 4. Jeffrey Scullin Jr. The entire community of Strongsville, Ohio, was rocked by tragedy in October 2017 when a beloved middle school teacher named Melinda Pleskovich was brutally attacked inside her home. Pleskovich's husband, Bruce, and her daughter's fiancé, 20-year-old Jeffrey Scullin Jr., arrived home to find her unresponsive and covered in blood. Someone had stabbed the 49-year-old at least 35 times with a tactical knife and shot her 3 times. The men dialed 911, but it was far too late to save Melinda. Scullin initially played the part of a grieving future son-in-law convincingly enough to be a pallbearer at Melinda's funeral. The Pleskoviches had opened their home to Scullin after learning that their daughter Anna was expecting his child, and the murder happened just weeks before the couple was set to marry. But the wedding was put off for obvious reasons, and Melinda's funeral took place on the date of the planned nuptials. In almost any case, the situation would absolutely devastate someone in Scullin's position. Just 3 days after the funeral, however, authorities charged him with aggravated murder and hauled him off to jail. He was also hit with 1 count each of felonious assault, child endangerment, and tampering with evidence. Prosecutors described Scullin as a conniving and manipulative thief who stole from the very family who generously put a roof over his head. Shortly after moving in with the Pleskoviches, police began responding to calls regarding suspicious activity at the home. Money was disappearing, car alarms were inexplicably going off in the middle of the night, and on one occasion Scullin claimed that he'd thwarted an attempted burglary while he was home alone. But security footage would later reveal that nobody showed up at the house on the day he claimed the incident took place. Authorities argued that Scullin's phony story was part of a plot to deflect blame for his own actions by making the Pleskovics believe that he was being targeted by a serial thief. They also noted that he was strangely calm at the scene of Melinda's murder and that he seemed unconcerned about her condition while being interrogated by police. Detectives further claimed that Scullin took measures to cover up the murder while pretending to grieve with Melinda's heartbroken loved ones. As the investigation wore on, Scullin's story began to fall apart. He told detectives that on the day of the murder, he visited an aunt before eating dinner at Applebee's with the other members of the Pleskovich family. But cell phone data put him at the crime scene at the time of Melinda's death. And DNA from a bloody knife found in Scullin's truck further pointed toward his involvement in the crime. Prosecutors never established a clear motive for the murder, and they admitted at trial that they weren't entirely sure what happened in the moments leading up to the horrific crime. but they were sure that Scullin was responsible, and they were determined to nail him to the wall. During court proceedings, Scullin's defense attorney stated that he and his client believed they had an affirmative defense. In layman's terms, this suggested that they were prepared to argue that Scullin killed Melinda in self-defense if the case went to trial. Scullin ultimately pleaded no contest to the charges and was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 33 years. He never expressed any remorse for his actions or apologized to Melinda's surviving loved ones. And while handing out the punishment, the judge who oversaw the case mentioned that she was particularly saddened about the fact that Melinda and Bruce's teenage son, who has Down syndrome, didn't understand that his mother was gone forever. Number 3. Corey Richens. Corey Richens is a mother of 3 and real estate agent from Utah who suddenly became widowed in early 2022 when her husband, 39-year-old Eric Richens, died under mysterious circumstances. The couple were celebrating Corey's sale of a house when they fell asleep, but several hours later Corey dialed 911 and said that she awoke to find Eric unresponsive and cold to the touch. She told police that she made her husband a Moscow Mule, which he drank in bed, but that she had no idea why or how he might have ended up in such a precarious state. Eric was unfortunately pronounced dead at the scene. Police launched an investigation, but answers didn't come quickly. The probe was still ongoing a year after Eric's death when Corey published a children's book she wrote to help her sons process the loss of their father. The story is about a little boy who loses his dad but is comforted by the reminders of his father that surround him. Richens' book received national media attention, but in the meantime, the investigation continued. People who followed the story were shocked when authorities charged Corey with Eric's murder in May 2023, just a few months after her book came out. According to detectives, Corey lied about not using her phone after she found Eric unresponsive. Records indicate that she sent and received several text messages during that time frame and that she deleted them from her phone. A toxicology report showed that Eric had 5 times the lethal dose of fentanyl in his system. The medical examiner concluded that he ingested it orally, indicating that it may have been mixed into the cocktail Corey served him on the night he died. An acquaintance of Corey's, identified only as CL in court documents, reportedly told police that Corey had contacted him in search of narcotic painkillers in the weeks leading up to Eric's death. He also allegedly admitted to selling Corey 30 fentanyl pills for $800. Investigators also learned that Eric had gotten sick just 6 days before he died after eating Valentine's Day dinner with Corey. It happened 3 days after Corey allegedly bought the fentanyl, suggesting that she may have either tried and failed to kill Eric or perhaps conducted a dry run to see how the drugs affected him and how much it might take to kill him. And according to prosecutors, Corey reached out to another drug dealer shortly after the Valentine's Day incident in search of more pills. In addition to being charged with murder, Corey faces 1 count of intent to distribute for having a large amount of GHB in her possession. Eric's family claimed that Corey had a financial motive for wanting her husband dead. They told the press that she began having serious money problems in 2016. And around the same time, the family says Corey began stealing money from Eric to finance her business projects. By the time Eric discovered the missing funds, she'd allegedly drained his bank account dry and racked up loan and credit card debts to the tune of $380,000. Corey is now being held without bail while she awaits her next court date. According to the most recent updates on the case, the prosecution has requested a gag order to prevent those involved with the case from speaking with the overzealous media. Number 2. Doppelganger murder. This case may seem too bizarre to possibly be real, but believe it or not, it is. It all started in August 2022 when German authorities discovered an abandoned Mercedes-Benz in a wooded area in Ingolstadt with a woman's body inside. And unfortunately, she'd been stabbed more than 50 times. Police initially believed the body belonged to the car's owner, a 23-year-old German-Iraqi woman named Sharaban K. But an autopsy found that the deceased individual wasn't Sharaban, but a woman named Khadija O, who'd recently gone missing. Further investigation revealed that Sharaban sought Khadija out during a search for a woman who looked similar to her. It was all allegedly part of a sinister plot for Sharaban to fake her own death by finding and killing her doppelganger. A search of Sharaban's social media activity only furthered law enforcement's belief that this was her plan all along. Authorities are accusing Sharaban of carrying out the murder due to ongoing family issues, but they decline to go into detail regarding the nature of the problems. She and her boyfriend, Shakir K, have been arrested in connection with the crime. They could both spend time behind bars if found guilty of the charges against them, with Sharaban potentially facing a life sentence. Number 1. Deonta Greer. In late 2015, Atlanta police found a young mother of 3 named Tiffany Bailey clinging to life inside her apartment. The 24-year-old had been shot in her left eye in front of her family, and she died from her injuries 2 days later. Tiffany's live-in boyfriend, 26-year-old Deonta Greer, admitted to investigators that he sold marijuana. He claimed that a customer came over to buy some weed, but demanded the product at gunpoint. Greer said that he was trying to disarm the customer when the fatal shot was fired. He implicated some teenagers in the crime, but their alibis quickly checked out, and they were cleared of any wrongdoing. Authorities were suspicious of Greer, especially after a witness said they saw him searching for something along a fence line outside his apartment building. They believed he'd thrown the murder weapon into the area and was retrieving it. Investigators also learned that things had been rocky between Greer and Tiffany for quite some time. The couple's problems worsened just days before the shooting, when the landlord gave Tiffany an ultimatum: kick Greer out since he wasn't on the lease or face eviction. Around the same time, Tiffany told a relative that she planned to break up with Greer. Even after uncovering the troubled nature of the relationship, however, there wasn't enough evidence to charge him with Tiffany's murder. 10 days after the disturbing tragedy, friends and family gathered at a local church for Tiffany's funeral. Greer was also there, despite the mounting suspicions against him. During the service, he reportedly confessed to killing Tiffany in the presence of an off-duty police officer who flagged down a uniformed cop and told him that Greer wished to turn himself in for the homicide. Greer was then charged with murder and was held in custody while the investigation continued. Sadly, Tiffany's kids had witnessed the crime, and they told specially trained interrogators what they'd seen. A friend of the killer also claimed that Greer had admitted to shooting Tiffany while they wrestled over the gun during an argument. Despite Greer's confession and the overwhelming circumstantial evidence against him, he pleaded not guilty to the crime. During his trial, the defense maintained Greer's original story about a marijuana deal gone wrong, but the jury was unconvinced, and Greer was convicted of Tiffany's murder. As a result, he was sentenced to life in prison plus 15 years and remains behind bars after unsuccessfully appealing the verdict. Would you rather learn that someone you considered a close friend of many years often told other people that they secretly couldn't stand you, or lose out on an extremely high-paying promotion after a jealous supervisor purposely trained you to do the job improperly? Let us know in the comments below, but be sure to subscribe first. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.